Joining us right now is a man who, like President George H.W. Bush, also ran the CIA. It's former Director John Brennan. Director Brennan, I think one of the most underreported sections of George H.W. Bush's life is his time as director of the CIA. And I want to read the letter that you and other former directors released over the weekend, because it reminded me of this extraordinary period in which he led the CIA. You wrote, as he approached that position as head of the CIA, as he did everything in his life as a duty and an honor to serve, he assumed the role when the CIA was experiencing great turmoil. He quickly strengthened morale among the agency workforce and confidence in the CIA throughout government. Although his tenure was short, the impact on the agency is indelible. The 1999 naming of the CIA headquarters compound, the George Bush Center for Intelligence, was a fitting gesture to honor a man who embodied all that is best in public service. His leadership was the North Star that we all tried to emulate during our time at the agency. What did he mean to the CIA, Director Brennan?
Well, he meant a lot, Nicole. He was director for less than a year. I think it was just almost a year. But he always referred to it as one of the most cherished periods of his professional life. He enjoyed working with CIA employees. He wanted to understand as much as he could about the mission of intelligence. And it was a tough time for the agency. There was a lot of turmoil after a number of the congressional hearings and exposure of some of the CIA activities. And he brought a sense of leadership and confidence. And it was something that was, I think, much appreciated by the men and women of the CIA. In early 2016, we brought him back to CIA headquarters to celebrate the 40th anniversary of his swearing in as director of CIA. And he spent about 4 or 5 hours out at the agency. And he was just welcomed with open arms by the entire workforce. There were long lines of people as he went down the corridors of Langley in his wheelchair. And people were just glad-handing him and just applauding him, because he really represented, I think, the best of this country from the standpoint of selfless sacrifice. So when he became vice president and when he became president, he looked to the agency to provide him the insights, the information, the analysis that he needed in order to ensure that the decisions he was making on behalf of the country were as informed and as reasoned and as enlightened as possible.
Director Brennan, what did it mean to the CIA to have someone who understood the intelligence product, who understood the intelligence community's selflessness, really facelessness in many jobs there, as their ultimate customer when he became president? There's been so much said in the last 3 days about his foreign policy accomplishments. How did his understanding of the intelligence and his ability to think and see things the way you all do help him execute his foreign policy?
Well, first of all, I think it forced the CIA to be at the very top of this game, because here he is, a former director of CIA, former envoy to China, 8 years as vice president, and then becomes president. And so he understood exactly what the intelligence capabilities were. He understood the strengths and weaknesses. He knew the world. He knew many of the world leaders at the time. So we were having to give a very, very well-informed and smart and intelligent consumer the best intelligence possible. I remember going into the Oval Office for my first time back in October of 1990, shortly after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And it was an intimidating experience for me to sit down with the President of the United States, and one who was so steeped in foreign affairs. But he couldn't have been more gracious. He couldn't have been more welcoming. And he felt as though the CIA was a place that was his home, and he relied on it heavily. He challenged us. He made sure that we were doing what we needed to do in order to keep this country safe and secure. But to have someone in the Oval Office who valued the work of the intelligence professionals, who understood the complexities of these world events, it was something that I think all CIA officers, ever since then, have truly respected in George H.W. Bush.
What is his loss, not just his death, but the loss of a period when our politics were populated by people like him who spent their career in the government, in public service? What is that moment like? How has that changed the way the CIA does their job?
Well, I think as people have said over the last several days, it is the passing of a generation. someone who was in World War II, who has seen such transformation around the world, but also was part of a political environment in Washington where you can work with your political adversaries, but do it in a way that continues to reflect the values and the principles of this country. And so with his passing from the scene, even though over the years, the last several years, he was less and less active, but he still symbolized I think, a special time in our lives. And having somebody like that who actually worked at Langley and who walked the corridors of Langley, I think CIA officers, women and men, just felt extremely proud that one of their own was in the Oval Office and then was such a revered and respected statesman. I think it's caused many to reflect upon the days when you have people like George H.W. Bush, who really is a beacon in many respects and a model for how individuals who aspire to and ascend to such positions of authority carry out their responsibilities with tremendous dignity and humility.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.